Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. This is Joe, the bearded historian. He'll tell you an interesting story. Be careful of his soldiers, they can be brats. This is Angel, she's an entity. She'll cause chaos and plant her hands at you. This is Sue, she likes spirits, not the alcohol. She's the reason this channel exists. This is David, he likes fire trucks. He's here occasionally. Bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong, bing bongy bong. We preserve his story.
It is Wednesday. I got another history video about the railroad. Railroads are fun and one of Joe's favorite topics on top of military stuff. So hopefully you'll find that interesting and not too boring. Just kidding. I actually fell asleep, but I was tired. So today's race, we're going to do a women's track. Y'all get to be women because, well, Mother's Day's coming up. Ready? Here we go. Shout out time. Here's a shout out just for you. You support me, so I support you. This shout out is for our friends. Let's see who it is today, okay? Start. There we go. Alright, so we've got Derek, Eddie, Amanda, Jamaican, Talks, Fractured, Mayhem, Lower, 755, Ohio, Abundance, Kifla, Misty, One Busy Mama, Talks, Carter, Nikki and Happy, Junk, Jamaican, let's see, who haven't I seen? There's Lower, Woman Outdoors, Mayhem, let's see, Bluegrass, Carter, who haven't I mentioned yet? I think I've got Abundance, there's some people, VS, Supercalifragilistic, Alice, CNC, Martin, Odin. Oh, it's Ogden. Alright, so Ogden Knight, 51 years old, a little older than Joe, and he plays games. So we've got lots of games. Fortnite. I'll show some shorts. And Modern Warfare. So if you like games, check them out. Like, share, comment, and enjoy Joe's ramblings. Alright, tell us a story, weird historian.
Well, in celebration and noting of the first Transcontinental Railroad, known as originally as the Pacific Railroad, later the Overland Route, celebrated a milestone in history when they reached Promontory Point Summit in Utah Territory and put down the famous Golden Spike connecting two major rail lines, the Union Pacific from the west, while the Central Pacific was building east, and they would meet in the last leg right in the middle with Western Pacific. Now, the way that this all worked out historically was, there was early proponents of building a railroad line that would connect the coast in the United States. A guy by the name of Dr. Hartwell Carver, who in 1847 submitted to the U.S. Congress a proposal to build a charter railroad from Lake Michigan to the Pacific Ocean, seeking a congressional charter to support his idea. Now, Congress agreed to support the idea under the direction of the Department of War. The Pacific Railroad surveys were conducted from 1853 through 1855. Now, this is all pre-Civil War. These included extensive series of expeditions in the American West seeking possible routes. A report on the explorations described alternative routes and included an immense amount of information about the American West, covering at least 400,000 square miles, and including the region's natural history and illustrations of reptiles, amphibians, birds, and mammals. Now, the report did not include detailed topographic maps of potential routes needed to estimate the feasibility, cost, and select the best route. Hey, look at the map, it's flat.
Woo!
However, the survey was detailed enough to determine that the best southern route would lie south of the Gila River boundary with Mexico in mostly vacant desert, though the future territories of Arizona and New Mexico. This has partially motivated the United States to complete the Gadsden Purchase. Well, in 1856, the Select Committee on the Pacific Railroad and Telegraph of the U.S. House of Representatives published a report recommending support of a proposed Pacific Railroad bill. As, quote, the necessity that now exists for constructing lines of railroad and telegraphic communications between the Atlantic and Pacific coasts of this continent is no longer a question for argument. It is conceded by everyone in order to maintain our present position on the Pacific. We must have some more speedy and direct means of intercourse than is present afforded by the route through the possessions of a foreign power. End quote. Now, quickly paint your pictures. Okay, the East Coast, starting out with the colonies, eventually the United States, growing west, expanded. Railroads were popping up everywhere. There was a lot of, commerce being made. And then all the way out on the West Coast in places like, California, Washington, those places, they had people, but there was still a lot of open terrain. Territories were being founded, states were being, put together. And so they needed a way not only for communication purpose, but also for settling people. It helped the middle of the nation and the, Rocky Mountain West area grow. Well, again, talking with the, U.S. Congress, that's strongly divided on where this eastern terminus of the railroad should be. In a southern or northern city, and 3 routes were considered. One northern route along the Missouri River through present-day northern Montana and Oregon territory, considered impractical because of the rough terrain and extensive winter snows. No. A central route, following the Platte River in Nebraska, through the South Pass in Wyoming, following most of the Oregon Trail. Snow on this route was remaining a concern. And then a southern route across Texas, New Mexico territory, the Sonora Desert, connecting to Los Angeles. Now, surveyors found during an 1848 survey the best route lay south of the border between the United States and Mexico. This was resolved by the Gadsden Purchase, as mentioned. Now, once the central route was chosen, it was immediately obvious that the western terminus would be Sacramento. But there was also considerable difference of opinion about where the eastern terminus should be. Now, 3 locations along a 250-mile stretch of the Missouri River were considered. There was St. Joseph, Missouri, accessed by the Hannibal and St. Joseph Railroad. Kansas City, accessed by the Leavenworth, Pawnee, and Western Railroad. And Council Bluffs, i.e. Omaha, Nebraska, accessed via the extension of the Union Pacific. Now, Council Bluffs had several advantages as well north of the Civil War fighting in Missouri. It was the shortest route to South Pass in the Rockies in Wyoming and would follow a fertile river which would encourage settlement. Durant had hired the future president Abraham Lincoln in 1857 when he was an attorney to represent him in a business matter about a bridge over the Missouri. Now, Lincoln was responsible for choosing the eastern terminus, and he relied on Durant's counsel. Durant advocated for Omaha, and he was so confident of the choice that he began buying up land in Nebraska. Gee, set the table, folks. Now, several of the names that wound up painting this picture, one was a guy named Asa Whitney. One of the most prominent champions of the Central Route. He envisioned a route from Chicago and the Great Lakes to Northern California, paid for by the sale of land to settlers along the route. Whitney traveled widely to solicit support from businessmen and politicians, printed maps and pamphlets, submitted several proposals to Congress, all at his own expense. In June of 1845, he led a team along part of the proposed route to assess its feasibility. Well, his legislation to begin construction of the Pacific Railroad, called the Memorial of Asa Whitney, was first introduced to Congress by Representative Zadok Pratt. Congress did not immediately act on Whitney's proposal. Another name was Theodore Judah. He was a fervent supporter of the Central Route Railroad, lobbying vigorously in favor of the project, and undertook a survey of the route through the rugged Sierra Nevadas, one of the chief obstacles of the project. Well, in 1852, Judah was the chief engineer of the newly formed Sacramento Valley Railroad, the first railroad built west of the Mississippi River. Although the railroad later went bankrupt once the easy placer gold deposits around Placerville, California were depleted, Judah was convinced that a properly financed railroad could pass from Sacramento through the Sierra Nevada mountains to reach the Great Basin and hook up with rail lines coming from the east. In 1856, Judah wrote a 13,000-word proposal in support of a Pacific Railroad and distributed it to cabinet secretaries, congressmen, and other influential people. In September of 1859, Judah was chosen to be an accredited lobbyist for the Pacific Railroad Convention, which indeed approved his plan to survey, finance, and engineer the road. Judah returned to Washington in December of 1859. He had a lobbying office in the United States Capitol and received an audience with President James Buchanan and represented the convention before Congress. Well, Judah would return to California in 1860. He continued to search for a more practical route through the Sierra, suitable for a railroad. In the mid-1860s, local miner Daniel Strong had surveyed a route over the Sierra for a wagon toll road, which he realized would also suit a railroad. He described his discovery in a letter to Judah in 1860. Charles Marsh, a surveyor, civil engineer, and water company owner, met with civil engineer Judah. Marsh, who had already surveyed a potential railroad route between Sacramento and Nevada City, California, a decade earlier, went to Judah went into the Sierra Nevada mountains. There they examined the Hennis Pass Turnpike Company's route. Marsh was the founding director of that company. They measured elevations and distances and discussed the possibility of a transcontinental railroad. Both were convinced that this could be done. Judah, Marsh, and Strong met with merchants and businesses to solicit investors in their proposed railroad. Well, from January or February 1961 until July, Judah and Strong led a 10-man expedition to survey the route for the railroad over the Sierra Nevada, through Clipper Gap and Immigrant Gap, over Donner Pass, and south to Truckee. They discovered a way across the Sierras that was gradual enough to be made suitable for a railroad, although that still needed a lot of work. Now, there was a group through the Central Pacific Railroad called the Big Four. This was a group of businessmen: Leland Stanford, Collis Potter Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker. These all became substantially wealthy from their association with the railroad. Judah, Marsh, Strong, Stanford, Huntington, Hopkins, and Crocker, along with James Bailey and Lucius Anson Booth, became the first board of directors for the Central Pacific Railroad. There was also a former ophthalmologist, Thomas Clark Durant, who nominally was only vice president of the Union Pacific, so he installed a series of respected men like John Adams Dix as the president of the railroad. While serving as vice president of the Union Pacific, he would be a key figure in the credit mobilier scandal, which ultimately led to his removal from the company. Oops. I did bad. Major General Greenville M. Dodge served as chief engineer of the Union Pacific during the construction of the first Transcontinental Railroad. In 1865, while fighting against Native American tribes, he would discover a pass in the Laramie Mountains, which would serve as a vital passage for the first Transcontinental Railroad. Dodge would serve as the United States House of Representatives for Iowa's 5th District from 1867 until 1869. During this time, he would push for legislation to help the construction of the railroad. Now, in February of 1860, Iowa Representative Samuel Curtis introduced a bill to fund the railroad. It passed the House but died when it could not be reconciled with the Senate version because of opposition from the southern states, which wanted the southern route near the 42nd parallel. Curtis tried and failed again in 1861. After the southern states seceded from the Union, the House of Representatives approved the bill on May 6, 1862, and then the Senate on June 20th. Lincoln signed the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862 into law on July the 1st, and it authorized the creation of two companies, the Central Pacific in the West and the Union Pacific in the Midwest, to build the railroad. The legislation called for the building and operating of a new railroad from the Missouri River at Council Bluffs, Iowa, west to Sacramento, California, and on to San Francisco Bay. Another act to supplement the first was passed in 1864. The Pacific Railroad Act of 1863 established the standard gauge, which would be used in these federally financed railways. It'd be really bad to have two different sets of gauges.
What?
Also, to finance the project, the act authorized the federal government to issue 30-year U.S. government bonds at 6% interest. The railroad companies were paid at $16,000 per mile, about $543,000 per mile today, for track laid on a level grade, $32,000 per mile for track laid in the foothills, and $48,000 per mile for track laid in the mountains. The two railroad companies sold similar amounts of company-backed bonds in stock. While the federal legislation for the Union Pacific required no partner was to own more than 10% of the stock, the Union Pacific had problems selling its stock. One of the few subscribers was the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints leader Brigham Young, who supplied crews for building much of the railroad through Utah. Durant manipulated market prices on his stocks by spreading rumors about which railroads he had an interest in were being considered for connections with the Union Pacific. First, he touted rumors that his fledgling M&M Railroad had a deal in the works, while secretly buying stock in the depressed Cedar Rapids and Missouri Railroad. Then he circulated rumors that the CR&M had plans to connect to the Union Pacific, at which point he began buying back the M&M stock at depressed prices. Let's tell a few more lies, why don't you? It's estimated that his scams produced over $5 million in profits for him and his cohorts. Now, the Central Pacific financing, Collis Huntington, a Sacramento hardware merchant, heard Judah's presentation about the railroad at a St. Charles hotel in November of 1860. He invited Judah to his office to hear the proposals in detail. Huntington persuaded Judah to accept financing from himself and four others: Mark Hopkins, his business partner, James Bailey, a jeweler, Leland Stanford, a grocer, and Charles Crocker, a dry goods merchant. They each initially invested $1,500 each, formed a board of directors, and as we'd mentioned before, this became the Big Four, and their railroad was called the Central Pacific Railroad. Each eventually made millions of dollars from their investments in control of the Central Pacific Railroad. Well, before major construction could begin, Judah traveled back to New York City to help raise funds to buy out the Big Four. Shortly after arriving in New York, he died on November the 2nd, 1863, of yellow fever. He contracted while traveling over the Panama Railroad's transit of the Isthmus of Panama. The CPRR engineering department was taken over by his successor, Samuel S. Montague, as well as Canadian-trained chief assistant engineer, later acting chief engineer, Louis Metzler Clement, who also became the superintendent of track. Now, to allow the companies to raise additional capital, Congress granted the railroads a 200-foot right-of-way corridor lands for additional facilities like sidings and maintenance yards. They were also granted alternate sections of government-owned lands, 6,400 acres per mile, for 10 miles on both sides of the track, forming a checkerboard pattern. The railroad companies were given the odd number sections, while the federal government retained the even number sections. Now, the exceptions was in cities or at rivers or on non-governmental property. The railroads sold bonds based on the value of the lands, and in the areas with good lands like Sacramento Valley and Nebraska, sold the land to settlers, contributing to rapid development of the West. The total area of the land grants to the Union Pacific and Central Pacific were larger than the area of the state of Texas. Federal government land grants totaled about 130 million acres, and state government land grants totaled about 50 million acres. It was far from a given that the railroads operating in this thinly veiled West would make enough money to repay the construction and operation. If the railroad companies failed to sell the land granted to them within 3 years, they were required to sell it at the prevailing government price for homesteads, 1.25 cents per acre. If they failed to repay the bonds, all remaining railroad property, including trains and tracks, would revert to the U.S. government. To encourage settlement in the West, Congress passed the Homestead Acts, which granted an applicant 160 acres of land with the requirement the applicant improve the land. This incentive encouraged thousands of settlers to move west. The federal legislation lacked adequate oversight and accountability. Heaven forbid they want to do anything, ethical. The two companies took advantage of these weaknesses in legislation to manipulate the project and produce extra profit for themselves. Despite the generous subsidies offered by the federal government, the railroad capitalists knew they would not turn a profit on the railroad business for many months, possibly years. They determined to make a profit on the construction itself. Both groups of financiers formed independent companies to complete the project, and they controlled management of the new companies along with the railroad ventures. The self-dealing allowed them to build in generous profit margins paid out by the railroad companies. In the West, the four men heading the Central Pacific chose a simple name for heading the company, the Contracted Finance Company. In the East, the Union Pacific selected a foreign name, calling the construction firm Credit Mobilier of America. The latter company was later implicated in far-reaching scandal, which would greatly affect the railroad's purpose, described later. Also, the federal government, the lack of federal oversight provided by both companies with incentives to continue building their railroads past one another, since they were each being paid and receiving land grants based on how many miles of track they laid, even though only one track would eventually be used. This tactfully agreed profiteering activity was captured, probably accidentally, by the Union Pacific photographer Adam J. Russell in his images of the promontory trestle construction. But as the construction's progress would go from Iowa towards California, both sides working from each side, the primary, routes that they would take and work with, using the map systems that they had at the time. 1 second here. I have to roll because otherwise all the blood flows out of one side of my body. Survey teams were put out to produce detailed contour maps of the options as different routes. The engineering teams looked for best available surveys and chose which were the best routes. Survey teams under the direction of the engineers closely led the work crews and marked where and by how much hills would have to be cut and depressions filled or bridged. Coordinators were sure that constructions and other supplies were provided when and where needed. Additional supplies were ordered as the railroad construction consumed the supplies. Specialized bridging, explosives, and tunneling teams were assigned to specialized jobs. Some jobs, like explosive work, tunneling, bridging, heavy cuts, and fills, were known to take longer than others, so the specialized teams were sent ahead by wagon trains with the supplies and men to get the jobs done by the time the regular track laying crews arrived. Finance officers made sure the supplies were paid for and the men paid for their work. An army of men had to be coordinated, and seemingly never-ending chain of supplies had to be provided. The Central Pacific Road crew set a track laying record by laying 10 miles of track in a single day, commemorating this event with a signpost beside the track for passing trains to see. Hey, look at that sign, kids. Now, additioning to the track-laying crews, other crews were busy setting up stations with provisions for loading fuel, water, other also mail, passengers, and freight. Personnel had to be hired to run these stations. Maintenance depots had to be built to keep all of the equipment repaired and operational. Telegraph operators had to be hired. to man each station to keep track of where the trains were so that the trains could run in each direction on the available single track without interference or accidents. Sidings had to be built to allow trains to pass. Provision had to be made to store and continually pay for coal or wood needed to run the steam locomotives. Water towers had to be built for refilling locomotives. Water towers had to be built for water tanks on the engines, and provisions made to keep them full. Now, labor, the majority of the Union Pacific track across Nebraska and Wyoming territories were built by veterans of the Union and Confederate armies, as well as many immigrants. Brigham Young, as mentioned before, landed contracts with the Union Pacific and offered jobs for about 2,000 members of the church with hope that the railroad would support the commerce in Utah. Church members built most of the road through Utah. Construction Superintendent Durant repeatedly failed to pay the wages agreed upon. The Union Pacific train carrying him to the final spike ceremony was actually held up by unpaid workers at Piedmont, Wyoming, until he paid them for their work. Representatives of Brigham Young had less success and failed in court to force him to honor his contract. Well, the manual labor to build the Central Pacific's roadbed, bridges, and tunnels was done primarily by thousands of immigrant workers from China under the direction of skilled non-Chinese supervisors. These Chinese were commonly referred to at the time as Celestials, and China as the Celestial Kingdom. Labor-saving devices these days consisted primarily of wheelbarrows, horse or mule-pulled carts, and a few railroad-pulled gondolas. The construction work was involved in an immense amount of manual labor. Initially, Central Pacific had a hard time hiring and keeping unskilled workers on its line, as many would leave for the prospect of far more lucrative gold or silver mining operations elsewhere. Now, despite the concerns expressed by Charles Crocker, one of the Big Four and the general contractor, that the Chinese were too small in stature and lacking of previous experience with railroad work, they decided to try them anyway. After the first few days of trial with a few workers, noticeably positive results, Crocker decided to hire as many as he could, looking primarily at the California labor force. This is where the majority of the Chinese worked as independent gold miners or in the service industries. Most of the Chinese workers were represented by a Chinese boss who translated, collected salaries for his crew, kept discipline, and relayed orders from an American general supervisor. Most Chinese workers spoke only rudimentary or no English, and supervisors typically only learned rudimentary Chinese. Many more workers were imported from the Guangdong province of China, which at the time, beside great poverty, suffered from the violence of the Taiping Rebellion. Most Chinese workers were planning on returning with their newfound wealth when the work was completed. Most of the men received between $1 to $3 per day, the same as an unskilled white worker, but the workers imported directly from China sometimes even received less. A diligent worker could save over $20 per month after paying for food and lodging, a fortune by Chinese standards. A snapshot of workers in the late 1865 showed about 3,000 Chinese and about 1,700 white workers employed on the railroad. Nearly all of the white workers were in supervisory or skilled craft positions, made more money than the Chinese. Most of these easy workers, early workers of the Chinese Pacific, consisted of constructing the railroad track bed, cutting and blasting through hills, filling in washes, building bridges or trestles, digging blasting tunnels, and then laying the rails over the Sierra Nevada mountains. Once the Central Pacific was out of the Sierras and the Carson Range, progress speed up considerably as the railroad bed could be built over nearly flat ground. In those days, the Central Pacific did a section of 10 miles in one day as a demonstration of what they could do on flat ground, like most of the Union Pacific had in Wyoming and Nebraska. While the track laying was divided into various parts, the advance of the track layers, surveyors consulting with engineers determined where the track would go. Workers then built and prepared the roadbed, dug or blasted through hills, filled in the washes, built trestles in similar fashion, and the actual track laying gang would then lay rails on the previous laid out ties positioned on the roadbed, drive in the spikes, and bolt the fish plate bars to each rail. At the same time, another gang would distribute the telegraph poles and wire along the grade while the cooks prepared dinner and the clerks busied themselves with accounts, records, using the telegraph line to relay requests for more materials and supplies or communicate with supervisors. So pretty much the effective use, up through 1866. Almost all the roadbed work had to be done manually because, at that time it was about how everything had to work. Driving spikes, digging through tunnels. Sometimes you use dynamite to blast out tunnels. But as they got closer to their points, they would wind up meeting into Utah, and they were able to finally make the final spike at Promontory. But it was a neat little day in the celebration. It united both the East Coast with the West Coast. A couple months later, they were able to finally make it all the way out to the Pacific Ocean. But this has been our little bit of history. You folks have a good time, and we will talk to you next week. Have a good one.